Yeah, we're going to start this afternoon session. We will have two speakers. So Jeffrey Chambers is professor at University of California, Berkeley. He has led projects focused on understanding how Amazonian forests respond to climate change and disturbances. He's the lead scientist of a project funded by the Department of the Energy in the US called the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment in the Tropics, NG Tropics. I'll probably be talking about this project, among other things. We've known each other for quite some time, and it's really a delight to have you and have you present your talk today. So you know the audience are right around 100 people here based in Cayenne in French Guiana at the University of French Guiana auditorium. And we're so sorry that you couldn't make it in person, but it will be for next time. So floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jérôme. And yeah, sorry I couldn't join you all. It was just a little too logistically complicated to make it all work out. The bulk of my talk today is going to be on this paper that we're writing, and it's in revision right now. And these are all the co-authors on this paper. And as Jérôme mentioned, this project is part of this larger project that I've been leading for, I think it must be 7 years now, which is called the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment Tropics. It's funded by the Department of Energy in the US. And really what it is it's this decadal scale effort to improve the representation of tropical forests in Earth system models, in these climate models. A lot of these kind of feedbacks from tropical forests to the atmosphere to the climate system are poorly represented. And so we've got 10 years to greatly improve the representation of tropical forests in these models. Our deliverable for this project is a model, and our model is called the Functionally Assembled Terrestrial Ecosystem Simulator, FATES, and it's designed to plug into this Earth system model, the DOE Earth system model called E3SM, and run within this kind of modeling framework. It's unique. A lot of the ways in which the land surface is represented in these Earth system models, these climate models, is as what we refer to as this kind of big leaf model. And FATES, our model, is unique in that it can resolve disturbances and the legacy of these disturbances. It's trait driven. So there's dynamic ecosystem assembly in this model. Ecosystems don't just map to climate, they emerge dynamically. And so the boundaries of these ecosystems can shift following ecosystem assembly rules. So we're essentially putting community ecology in Earth system models. It's also process rich. There's nutrient cycling in the model, there's plant hydraulics, there's fire, and there's multiple levels of complexity. And it's not just building this model. So there's this kind of philosophy and these big team science projects within the DOE called MODEX, which is essentially informing models with experimental data. So a big part of the project is figuring out what are those tropical forest processes that we need to include in the models? How well are they currently represented, and how much data do we have in order to kind of inform that representation? And in those cases where we don't have sufficient data, we go out and we collect this data. So here's just a few images of a large number of our collaborators. This is from a site in the central Amazon near Manaus. We have leaf level gas exchange, temperature, leaf temperature, soil moisture, matrix potential for leaves, tower-based studies, soil pits, phenology. So there's a lot of actual data that goes into building this model. Okay, so now let's jump into the bulk of the talk. It's this paper that I'm working on. I'm revising right now with a large group of collaborators in the project and elsewhere. And so the overarching question of this project is how will tropical forest trees, community assembly, and forest atmosphere interactions respond to higher temperatures and more intense droughts over the coming decades? So that's the question that motivated this study. So it's a case study. It's carried out at a site in the central Amazon. There's a 30-year replicated selective logging experiment that I'll tell you more about beyond that is the central part of this study. We're looking at how specific functional traits respond to hot droughts. We have a suite of ecophysiological measurements from the deep soil all the way up to the forest canopy atmosphere interface. A key part of this study is to try to identify threshold conditions that ultimately lead to tree stress, hydraulic collapse, and mortality. And then we use these climate models, these Earth system models, to project forward and ask the question, when will those threshold conditions become more prevalent? And so with respect to hot droughts, one way in which droughts emerge in the Amazon is due to El Nino conditions. And so this is just kind of an image of how that plays out. So typically you have this intense convection over the Western Pacific. And during El Nino conditions shown here in the bottom, you get this very large plume of anomalously warm water off the coast of South America. This convection plume moves towards the east, and then the high pressure side of this Walker cell convective activity then sets up over the Amazon. So where you typically have this high pressure setting up over the west coast of South America, that high pressure shifts over to the Amazon, and then you get these very dry conditions that you can see here using this WASP index that measures precipitation deficits for the El Nino event that occurred in June through November of 2015. This drought anomaly here. So this is this anomalously large pool of warm water. So convection moves from this region here over towards the Eastern Pacific, sets up high pressure over the Amazon. And then this time series here shows the positive excursions here from what are typical conditions in the Pacific indicate the intensity of the El Nino event, and in turn, the intensity of the drought in the Amazon. So during this 2015-2016 event, you can see that there was this very large excursion in terms of standard deviations away from what you would expect. And as you can see right now, we're moving into another ENSO period. And it has been incredibly dry in the Amazon. And this lower panel here shows this emerging El Nino event that is causing, as I mentioned, another intense drought in the Amazon. So how do these intense droughts affect tree mortality rates in the Amazon? So as I mentioned, this study is in the central Amazon. Here's the city of Manaus. This is the Rio Negro here coming in from the west, the main stem of the Amazon River. Our research site is just north of Manaus. I guess you probably can't see my pointer. I didn't really think about getting a pointer, but there's a road that comes towards the west here, just north of Manaus, and that's where our study site is. I mentioned this Beyonce logging experiment. So this experiment was set up in the early 80s, and the idea here was to look at how selective logging of varying intensities affected a number of forest dynamics processes. So it's a block design with these 4-hectare experimental blocks. And then the centermost hectare of this one treatment is a permanent inventory plot that is then now measured annually for more than 30 years. So let's so this is another representation of that logging experiment. So these are 4-hectare treatment blocks, control treatments where there was no logging, light logging in this light red, medium logging in this darker red, and heavy logging in the brightest red here. So you can see that there's a total of 12 hectares of plots, and these plots are measured annually for now more than 30 years. And this is unique. A lot of these kind of studies of forest dynamics and these permanent inventory plots are measured at 5-year intervals or 3-year intervals or whatever it might be. This is one of these rare studies that these plots have been measured annually, in this case for more than 30 years. And that allows you to explore the relationship of things like tree mortality with climate anomalies at a much greater detail, in much greater detail. So here's some of those data. So this is showing the total biomass of the mean biomass with these lines here, the average of the 3 hectares in each treatment. And you can see, so here is the logging treatment. There was also a lot of kind of collateral damage due to the logging. So the exact treatment intensities kind of varied as a function of that kind of collateral damage. But you can see that there was this loss of biomass associated with the selective logging. And then these plots return biomass accumulated over time. And you can see that the control plots actually also showed this accumulation of biomass over time that actually is frequently seen in primary forest plots that weren't logged. But again, the biomass has been recovering in these plots. It hasn't actually gotten back to pre-logging levels, but it's moving in that direction. Here's wood density. So this is the average plot scale wood density. So you can see that prior to logging, these plots had similar wood density values at approximately 0.70, 0.71. And then there's this decline in average wood density associated with colonization from early successional species. And then there is a slow recovery of that average wood density over time. But as you can see, the time it takes for average wood density to recover to pre-disturbance levels is much longer. And that's actually associated with these community assembly processes and forest succession and the time required for the species composition to return to those pre-disturbance conditions. Okay, so now let's look at the relationship between, in this top panel here, these are tree mortality rates for those 12 hectares. And then the lines here are the average of 3 plots in each of the treatments and the control. And then this measure here of precipitation anomalies over time. So you can see there were 3 intense droughts over this time period. This most recent one in 2016, as I mentioned, was caused by an El Nino event. These previous ones were actually caused by, this one in 2010 was actually caused by anomalously warm waters in the Atlantic Ocean, associated with this process called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And in fact, this year you have both happening simultaneously, and this Atlantic anomaly. The figure here to the right is this multi-level Bayesian analysis that we did on the relationship between Bionti tree mortality rates and the monthly drought intensity that is then nested within year and the logging treatments. And so what you see here is that the degree to which these parameter estimates differ from 0 represent the strength of that relationship. So in this case, you have this very strong parameter associated with the precipitation anomaly in September that's associated with mortality rates the year after that event. And so what this is saying is that when you have anomalously dry months of August, September, and October, so these parameter estimates, confidence, credibility intervals are completely off of the zero line here, that mortality rates in the subsequent year are most highly associated with anomalies, precipitation anomalies in those months. And that makes sense, because when you have an intense drought in the Amazon that's associated with El Nino and also with the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, these droughts tend to materialize in the months of September and October. So these are the months where where the rainy season typically starts in Manaus, and these droughts delay the onset of the wet season. Interestingly enough, as you can see here, these anomalies for these very wet months of March and April, those are also quite significant with respect to this credibility intervals, which shows that anomalously wet years also had elevated mortality. And we think that that's actually associated with wind throw and intense storms that you get more of during these wet months. So if we look at just the 2015-2016 event, we quickly established some ecophysiological measurements to try to better understand why are these trees dying. And so in this case, what we've done is we've installed these sensors called sap flow sensors. These sensors measure the flux of water up the stem. As you can see here, this sap velocity. And then in the panel in the lower left here, you see soil water content and how that varies over time. And if you notice, in the month of October and November of 2015, you have this big decline in sap velocity for some of these sensors. And we were only able to kind of get a few of these sensors set up. And as you see that as soil moisture is dropping steeply in the month of October, associated with this El Nino drought, you can see sap flow also declining. So when we looked at the longer time series, shown here in the upper right, of soil moisture on the x-axis and sap velocity on the y-axis, you see these blue points here under this light limitation condition. This is typically what you see year after year in both the wet season and the dry season. It never gets dry enough so that soil moisture limits transpiration. Transpiration is, under these conditions, is limited by light. And even during the dry season, there's sufficient soil moisture to drive continued transpiration throughout the dry season. But what we found in October of 2015 is there were these few weeks, and this only occurred during a few weeks, where there was this sharp drop in transpiration associated with these very low soil moisture conditions. And this actually leads to this hypothesis that once you cross this threshold, this is when you start to induce extreme stress in trees, and you start to see what's called hydraulic collapse that can ultimately lead to elevated mortality in trees. And so it's a proposed mechanism for what drives elevated mortality and the exact conditions that drive elevated mortality during these droughts. And these droughts are hot. So as the climate continues to warm, any given drought is going to be under hotter conditions just due to the fact that the temperature of the planet is warming due to climate change. So here's an infrared view of the upper canopy during that 2015 El Nino event. And you can see temperatures here of 42, 43 Celsius in these leaves in the upper canopy. So what you find is that during these hot droughts, as soil moisture starts to become limiting during the most extreme conditions, there also is this decoupling of air temperature and leaf temperature, where leaf temperatures start to become much hotter than the air temperature, because the plants are no longer able to cool themselves through transpiration. And you can see that this is a nonlinear effect in the lower left panel here. That as air temperatures continue to climb and as soil moisture becomes limiting, leaf temperatures show this nonlinear relationship with air temperature and this kind of decoupling that you can see over time on the panels in the right there. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're currently under another ENSO drought across the Amazon. Here's data for the height of the Rio Negro in Manaus over a very long period of 120 years. And as you can see, 2010 was the previous year with the lowest water height in the Rio Negro. And this is the current height of the Rio Negro in 2023. So as you can see, we're approaching record drought conditions in the Amazon. This is just one image of that. This town, this small village called Tumbira, that is just west of Manaus on the Rio Negro. And the figure to the left shows that village under kind of normal conditions. And the figure on the route on the right is what is happening right now, the current conditions. The drought is really extreme. So since 2015, in 2015, in that previous El Nino drought, we kind of scrambled to get some sensors in place to try to better understand the relationships between soil moisture and sap flow and leaf temperature and plant stress. So in the intervening years, we've moved well beyond, a handful of sap flow sensors. And so this site, this Bionte site, where this selective logging experiment occurred, and where there's also a very large variety of functional traits because of this, a larger number of early successional species in this kind of forest that was disturbed and is recovering from disturbances. So we have just vastly more instrumentation to study this current drought. There's a new tower that our colleagues at INPA put up. We transported this canopy lift that has a maximum working height of 26 meters. You can see a few people doing gas exchange measurements, and you actually see this is from a drone, so you can see both the tower in the background here with that red oval, and then the canopy lift at the bottom of this image. We also have just a much greater depth of ecophysiological instrumentation to study this drought. And this is happening right now. In the previous work, we had 4 or 5 sap flow sensors. We have 120 sap flow sensors now. We have multiple soil pits to look at volumetric water content, but also stem matrix potential and soil matrix potential, which is a measure of, the difficulty that plants have at extracting water from the soil, measured directly as matrix potential. Leaf gas exchange in the upper canopy, as I mentioned, both from the tower and from this canopy lift, leaf and canopy temperature, drone flights for canopy dynamics, eddy covariance, solar-induced fluorescence. So these data are, we're just starting to kind of process this data now, but we should have a much better sense of, what exactly causes stress and death in trees under these kind of extreme conditions. This is just some data that my colleague Bruno Jimenez was just sharing with us yesterday. So here's precipitation and temperature, and as you can see, temperatures rising, extremely dry during August and September, and then a few wet events. So there was like a large 20 millimeter event in early September, and as you can see, canopy temperatures did decline, cool off, but they're continuing to rise. And so we don't really know exactly how this drought will fully develop, but we have a lot of really interesting data to kind of explore with this. Okay, and then the other part of this paper is that we wanted to ask the question, okay, so you've got these hot drought events that occur, they're rare. In the case of the 2015 drought, there was only a few weeks where these really extreme conditions emerged that caused what we think was hydraulic collapse in these trees and elevated mortality. And by the way, the elevated mortality was greater in the early successional guild. So fast strategy species experienced greater mortality, greater hydraulic collapse in these droughts. And then we wanted to ask the question, when are those conditions, how will those conditions change the frequency with which those conditions occur in the future? So we first started looking at this from the suite of Earth system models, climate models called CMIP, Climate Model Intercomparison Project 5. This is based on the previous IPCC report. And as part of the revision, we're redoing this analysis with CMIP 6 models. And so what are we looking at here? This is this classic Whittaker plot. It shows the Earth, all the Earth's biomes in this kind of mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation space. So wet tropical forests are up in the upper right here. And so observations to the left, the upper left, the CMIP 5 models to the upper right. And as you can see, that the models do a reasonable job of predicting these climate envelopes associated with the current distribution of all of Earth's biomes, including these wet tropical forests. In the lower left, that is the same mapping on this Whittaker plot of mean annual temperature and precipitation at year 2100 using these same CMIP 5 models. And as you can see, at the warmest end of this distribution, you get a shift in some fraction of the planet that is under this climate that is much warmer than what we currently have on Earth. So these conditions actually here, just off this figure greater than 30 degrees Celsius, these are conditions that likely haven't been on Earth for potentially millions of years. So this is a new, hotter biome that is emerging. It hasn't existed on Earth for potentially millions of years. And our ability to understand how these tropical forests will respond to these new conditions is really challenged. But these hot drought events provide a kind of a window. They provide a window to this future hotter climate that's going to become much more prevalent. The figure on the lower right here shows the fraction of the Earth that is in this hypertropical state, under this hypertropical biome, out to year 2100. And you can see that depending on the scenario, depending on, just how radically we change the climate, a very significant fraction of the planet will find itself under this new, much hotter biome that we call in this paper that I'm working on a revision for, the hypertropics. And then this figure here shows how the frequency, in this case of vapor pressure deficit, which is the dryness of the atmosphere that was associated with this strong El Nino event in 2015, 2016, and how many extreme VPD days you'll see in the future under these different scenarios. So these SSP scenarios are different warming intensities associated with projected future climates. And as you can see, once you pass around year 2040, depending on the scenario, the number of these extreme days, and remember, in the 2015 event, these really extreme conditions only occurred for a few weeks. But a few weeks of those extreme conditions was sufficient to cause pretty significantly elevated mortality in tropical trees. And as you can see, these extreme conditions that induce hydraulic collapse and mortality are expected to increase pretty dramatically, depending on exactly, how radically we change the climate. So to kind of wrap things up here, elevated tree mortality at the Beyonce experiment was associated with drought, but also years with high precipitation. The low wood density fast strategy species were the most vulnerable. And this also indicates that secondary forests are likely to be more vulnerable to drought than primary forests. We're using these kind of ecophysiological measurements of like soil moisture and sap flow and matrix potential, vapor pressure deficit, leaf gas exchange. We're using these ecophysiological measurements to better understand the threshold conditions that induce hydraulic collapse and lead to elevated mortality. And we're exploring these relationships in much greater depth under this current ENSO event, because we've just been able to kind of instrument this site much better since 2015, 2016. And we're creating this new hotter tropical biome. And by the end of this century, we may well have created a new biome that hasn't existed on Earth for millions of years. And so what are the forest community assembly mechanisms that are going to play out in this new biome? Which species are vulnerable? Which are tolerant? And importantly, when will we cross key thresholds in the emergence of this new biome? Yeah, so that's all I had today. This project was obviously contributed by a large number of collaborators on our team. And yeah, thanks for your attention, and I'll take any questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Was really a thorough presentation. Fantastic work. Are there any questions from the audience? So yes, there is one question from Damien Bonal, whom you may know.
Oh, yeah. Is it in the chat?
No, I'm going to speak in the microphone. Can you hear me?
Oh, great. Yes, I can.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot for this great overview of the NGEE Tropics project and some recent results. I got a question about tree mortality and functional traits or measurements that you may have done on these trees. I was wondering whether at your sites, did you already, by chance, measure any sap flow, water potential, and so on, measurements on these trees which after died? Because the question is always the mechanisms of tree death. We always question this, and I was wondering whether you had by chance this opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, when the 2014 or 2015, 2016 El Nino drought was emerging, we were just starting to get this site instrumented. And so we kind of rushed down, and we were able to get, I think we initially set up 6 or 7 sensors, and a number of them failed. By the time the drought actually got to its most intense point, we only had 4 sensors that were working, 4 sap flow sensors. But there was a very similar response in those 4 sensors, as I can show you from, let's see, let me pop that back up here. Now, we currently have 120 sensors set up. So here's those, in fact, one of those 4 sensors failed, and then it started working again after the drought. So it actually failed during the drought. And then these 3 other sensors here. But so the current drought, we haven't obviously processed the data because it's occurring right now. We're in early October, which was the exact time when we have the most intense conditions during that previous ENSO event. So we don't know. I don't think we've seen it yet. I mean, we haven't processed the data yet. But it would actually be very interesting if some of these, well, 90 trees, because there are 30 trees that actually have 2 sets of sensors. So it'll be really interesting to see if any of these 90 trees actually die as we're measuring transpiration and sap velocity. But we haven't actually seen that yet in the data set.
Thanks a lot.
Did-
Are there more? I think it does address the question I thought was right. Yes. Thank you. Are there more questions? I do have a question. We attended the talk by Amy Zhang earlier today, and she was talking about decomposition. And I'd like to have your view about wood decomposition in the context, how much a big play it is in a carbon cycle, and how much data do you have in your site to address this issue of wood decomposition?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the trees die and they don't just release their carbon directly to the atmosphere. They need to kind of decompose, and then that ultimately is what releases the carbon. I did some of this work for my dissertation, and I had put some kind of TDR sensors and logs and stuff, and we definitely saw a threshold. Once you drop below a certain wood moisture content, the respiration flux from those dead trees just went to essentially zero. So they were a lot of the microbes that are decomposing wood are fungi. So those fungi are really sensitive to moisture stress. We don't have any sensors in place to actually measure the wood decomposition in this particular study, but I've got some data that I'd be more than happy to share with anyone who's interested in looking at that data on the relationship between volumetric moisture and respiratory flux from dead wood.
Well, thank you very much. Are there more questions in the audience? Doesn't seem so. So thank you very much again, Jeff, for fantastic presentation. Again, we're so sorry that you couldn't come with us to be with us and visit the French Guiana forest. So and many people in the audience know the Parakou field station bears a lot of resemblances to the BioNT experiment, and I hope we can forge some more collaborations in the future with these 2 sites.
Yeah,
okay.
It would be great to continue to collaborate.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to that, and hopefully I can make it there soon.
Yeah, well, hopefully, yes. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll move on